music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
The China Econ Talk newsletter. I spend hours every week looking for the most interesting Chinese language articles on tech, policy, and economics, and then spend more hours translating them for free. Check it out at chinaecontalk.substack.com. There's 3,000 of you listening to this show, but only 1,000 have subscribed to the newsletter. So sign up and make my day. Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. Maoism, A Global History is the best book I've read this far for China Econ Talk. It takes you from the origins of Maoism in Yan'an all the way to present Maoism in India and Nepal. It's deeply researched and tightly written, one of those books where you can't skip a page because there's always something new and interesting on every one. It's also very funny, a hard thing to pull off when you're talking about violent revolution and occasional mass murder. So to walk us through Maoist ideology and its surprisingly impactful global legacy, we have with us today author Julia Lovell. Julia, congratulations on the book and welcome to China Econ Talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So when I first started reading your intro, I wondered why this book had never been written before, but particularly as I got into the second half, where you go country by country into all these places that have to various degrees caught the Maoism bug, it became very clear why. So before we get into the content, could you talk a little bit about the research process?
The first thing to say is that in quite a few ways I chose a bad time to write this book, though actually it's not become a better time. The best time to write it would probably have been in the noughties, so the first decade of this century, when the PRC was experiencing a really unprecedented period of archival openness, and particularly notable was the opening of the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And to the best of my knowledge, this was a unique event in global communist history, the first time that the Ministry of a communist state had declassified part of its archives while the Communist Party in question was still in power. It's true the declassification stopped at the end of '65 before the Cultural Revolution, but this limited opening did illuminate parts of many previously obscured foreign policy issues, so Vietnam, the Bandung Conference, North Korea. So there were huge insights to be had. But then this archive was quite rapidly shut down after 2012, 2013 for a variety of political reasons, although the official explanation was systems upgrade. In general, it's become a lot harder to research within China, the Mao era, under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping owes much of his political prestige to his revolutionary bloodline as son of one of Mao's own comrades. And foreign policy of the Mao era is a topic of special sensitivity because one of the keynotes of the Mao era, especially from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, was so-called revolutionary diplomacy. So the CCP's desire to lead and instigate the world revolution. And China's rulers don't like to dwell now on the country's desire to lead the world revolution under Mao because it doesn't fit with contemporary rhetoric about China's peaceful rise to superpower status. And it also doesn't fit with protestations that other countries have no right to comment on or interfere in China's political affairs because China claims that it's never interfered in any other country's affairs. So the revolutionary diplomacy of the Mao era, including sponsoring insurgencies, especially in the developing world, really inconveniently puts the lie to that claim. It was also a bad time to write it because as a result of the political climate tightening up, witnesses to the Mao era became much less willing to speak to foreigners. And in any case, a lot of the archival material essential to writing the book would never be declassified unless the CCP fell from power. So there's going to be a huge number of important materials in the Central Committee archive, for example.
Sure.
So as a result, there was no single centralized archive for the book, and so research for this project was a truly global and time-consuming process. So I had to access sources in Chinese, English, Bengali, Vietnamese, Mongolian, Shona, French, Spanish, Italian, German and Norwegian in archives and libraries across Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Europe. I think this is one of the reasons why the book has not been written before because the archive is so dispersed and so global.
Were you surprised with just how much Maoist influence you ended up uncovering all around the world?
In some ways, yes, partly because for various reasons that we can discuss later on, this history has been substantially sidelined and even written out of general global histories of the Cold War. I think one great example of this is the importance of Maoist influences on the counterculture rebellions of Western Europe and the US during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Of course, there were hugely important sort of rebellious libertarian influences on these protests, but a certain reading or misreading of the Cultural Revolution was also hugely impactful on those rebellions and protests.
So, Julia, I want to come first to your first chapter, which I thought was a really creative and interesting way of exploring just what Maoism meant, particularly domestically in China. And the way you frame it was by taking these famous Mao phrases: the revolution is not our dinner party, practice is the sole criterion of truth, women can hold up half the sky, expose errors and criticize shortcomings, and then give a bit of background as well as history into where those phrases came from and what they meant for the movement and the CCP and the ideology more broadly. So maybe let's just run through a few of them to give us a bit of background and your sense of what role they played. Let's start with 革命不是请客吃饭. The revolution is not a dinner party. My personal favorite.
The quotation, revolution is not a dinner party, goes back to a moment in Mao's career in the midst of the revolution of 1927. At this point, the Chinese Communist Party is in an uneasy alliance with the Kuomintang, the nationalist party, and has been since 1923. And the objective of this alliance is to oust warlords who are controlling important parts of China and to create a unified revolutionary national government. But the two parties are pulling in different directions. The Kuomintang, the GMD under Chiang Kai-shek, are always far more naturally and comfortably allied with establishment, moneyed interests in China's cities and China's countryside. Whereas the Chinese Communist Party is far more fixated on more radical goals of wealth redistribution, social and economic justice. And Mao writes this turn of phrase at a moment which he finds particularly exciting to his own political development. It's when he is witnessing a peasant rebellion in his native Hunan in South China in the spring of 1927. And he is really witnessing the power of China's underclasses to violently sweep away established forces and power in the Chinese countryside. And this is a very, very important moment in the history of Chinese Communist Party when Mao acclaims the power of political violence to transform China. So the very early Chinese Communist Party from 1921 to 1927 is more of a somewhat loose coalition of study cells led by urban intellectuals. And in 1927, with the sort of rise of violence and a really horrendous purge, which is unleashed on the Chinese Communist Party by the Kuomintang, you see the passing of that earlier generation of leaders to a new generation of tougher army men with a deeper knowledge of China's rural grassroots, men who are, sort of ruthless about using violence to achieve their political aims. And Mao is the perfect example of such an individual.
So violence ends up being a real centerpiece of Maoist ideology, it seems.
Yes, and it's important also to remember what sort of a man Mao was in this early formative part of his political career from the late 1920s onwards. He was a man of the army. That's how he made his way to a senior position within the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, thinking back to Soviet precedents, to Soviet analogues, both Lenin and Stalin also worshipped the use of military force, but they were less closely connected with building an army and the workings of the army at such a formative stage in their political careers. Another of the very well-known sound bites of Mao that travelled within China and far beyond China is "Women can hold up half the sky." And because of this phrase, Mao was viewed very positively, was admired, for example, by second wave feminism in the United States and in Western Europe in the early 1970s. And I wanted to talk about this quotation because it really highlights the contradictoriness, the paradoxes of Mao, that he was able to come out with this kind of feminist rhetoric. I think arguably, none of Mao's global peers had such an openly egalitarian agenda, but his own practice towards women was disturbingly different. He was a serial womanizer. He treated the many women in his life absolutely terribly. You
wrote that he had venereal diseases, but he never showered. He instead had some horrific quote, I think you had in your book, about how he just uses young virginal women to clean his infected private parts.
And that was one of the many shocking details about Mao that came to light in his doctor's extraordinary memoir, The Private Life of Chairman Mao.
Okay, so the idea of phrases in general, this is not necessarily something that contemporary Chinese leaders really quite have a knack for. Where did this come from Mao? And can you talk a little bit about the importance of these sound bites as a way to spread the message both domestically as well as internationally?
I think that's a great question because Mao's talent for sound bites really did have an impact on the globalization of his ideas and his practice. I did quite a lot of oral history interviews with former and sort of still Maoist activists all around the world for the book, and many of them specifically mentioned Mao's power as a stylist, his ability to come up with these short, pithy, memorable turns of phrase. For example, in the Black Panther movement, the Little Red Book was used quite widely as a means of political education because of its interior design, that it was a series of short quotations that could be quickly read and quickly discussed. In terms of where this talent comes from, Mao, between the early 20th century and the late 1910s, he puts together quite a varied Western and Chinese education for himself. He's fluent in some aspects of Western philosophy, although he doesn't learn foreign languages. But he's also deeply fluent in, deeply familiar with the Chinese classics as well, especially essays on military strategy, above all, classic works of Chinese fiction. So I think his style can be seen as coming from that voracious reading. He surrounded himself with books, all the way pretty much up to his death, eyewitnesses who were, he worked from his bedroom. He had a sort of huge bed, and he would sit in bed and just surround himself with books, most of them in classical Chinese.
So, you have this quote from a collector of Mao merchandise in 2014 that you interviewed saying that Mao is greater than Genghis Khan because he was a poet, which I just think is a fantastic, fantastic line. It is perhaps this perplexing, inconsistent mutability in combination with memory of the political and military success of Mao that has given the political line which carries his name its potency, persuasiveness, and mobility. Somehow, Maoism is the creed of winners and insiders, of losers and outsiders, of leaders and underdogs, of absolute rulers, vast, disciplined bureaucracies, and oppressed masses. Frustrated with its contradictions, in its muddying of tidy disciples, Christophe Bousselier, authority on Maoism's journey in Europe, goes so far as to say, quote, Maoism doesn't exist. It never has done. That, without doubt, explains its success. Care to elaborate, Julia?
What I was trying to get at in that paragraph is that Maoism, although it has this singular name, it doesn't actually correspond to a single unitary phenomenon. So it's a set of ideas and practices that is living and breathing, that has been translated and mistranslated across different decades and across many different regions. And above all, it's a set of often very contradictory ideas. And this is no coincidence, because Mao himself was a great admirer of the idea of contradiction. He saw contradictions as possessing a kind of primal energy. He saw them as something which drove history on. So when there were contradictions in his own ideas or where he perceived them around him, he tended to embrace them. They didn't bother him. Inconsistency didn't bother him.
So I remember when I first came to Beida and I was wandering around the sort of garden north half of the campus, all of a sudden I stumbled across Edgar Snow's grave, which is not something that you would expect to be, given such a central place. But after reading this chapter, I understood just how important he and his book Red Star Over China was to the evolution of the CCP. So you say that it's difficult to overstate the influence across space and time of Red Star Over China. So let's dive into the book. First off, what is the book itself like to read today?
Read on face value, it's a rather charming book to read. Edgar Snow has a lovely, relaxed style. He has a great eye for landscape and for character. There's a nice, zingy sense of humour to the book. So there are still many.
I'm sorry.
Aspects.
I did this backwards. Let's go to first we should talk about how he writes the book. So you describe how Edward Snow was sort of bumbling around as a second-rate journalist in hopes of a scoop, and all of a sudden he meets someone who can give him this inside track into real China. So who was Song Qingling, and what was the broader strategy at the time for the Maoists in dealing with foreign reporters back in the pre-Civil War period?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say that Edgar Snow isn't really a second-rate journalist. I think he's established himself as a reporter of, great credibility and independence. He's travelled around China extensively. He's willing to criticise both his fellow expats. So he's sort of gone on record as in criticising their very isolated lifestyle, isolated from sort of ordinary Chinese people's lives. He's also been very, very critical of the nationalist government, which has been in power since 1927, 1928. So, he's very much established himself. But it is true that he's looking for a scoop that will really make his name globally, that will be a subject for a book which will, garner him more attention than isolated articles. And so in the early 1930s, he encounters this woman called Song Qingling, who is the widow by that point of the first president of China, Sun Yat-sen. And Song Qingling is a very remarkable woman, deeply cosmopolitan. So she was schooled first in Shanghai and then in the United States. So she has perfect English. She's a very cultured woman, sort of keeps a beautiful house, sort of loves opera and dinners and books and so on. When foreign literary celebrities come through Shanghai, where she lives, they're sure to call in on her, sort of George Bernard Shaw and others. She also has a very important role in Chinese politics at this time. So she has a close family connection to the nationalist regime. Her sister, Song Meiling, is the wife of Chiang Kai-shek. And gives Song Qingling an element of untouchableness. So in a climate where Chiang Kai-shek and his thugs are cracking down on any whisper of leftist ideology after a bloody purge of the Chinese Communist Party in 1927. Song Qingling is sort of allowed to carry on in Shanghai because of this family connection. And Song Qingling, after 1927, while her sister goes with the nationalist side of Chinese politics, Song Qingling leans heavily towards the Chinese Communist Party. She spends a period in Moscow after the things fall apart in China in 1927. And by the 1930s, she's become a very strong backer of the Chinese Communist Party's both undercover operations in Shanghai and supports them in their rural bases. So, for example, she makes sure that they can have radio contact between the rural bases and the cells of the party in Shanghai. She also gives a very large amount of her own personal savings to the Chinese Communist Party. But her role in this particular incident is I think probably her greatest value to the Chinese Communist Party is as a really appealing, attractive fellow traveller. So she herself actually is not allowed to join the Chinese Communist Party until she's on her deathbed in the 1980s, precisely because the CCP sees that she has greater public relations value as someone who is sympathetic but outside the party and therefore seeming more objective and more sort of reliable as a supporter of the party.
It's sort of like that CGTN host, right? Who's, not a party member. So, this is like a line that she used with the Fox host a few weeks back.
Right. Forgive me. I missed that. I missed that story. But the CCP lifted from Lenin something called the United Front strategy, and that strategy, you still see it at work outside China at the moment. You see it in New Zealand. You see it in Australia, and the principle is that the CCP should work with and work behind individuals and groups in society that are not part of the Chinese Communist Party in order to convince people who are not part of the Chinese Communist Party, who are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party, that the Chinese Communist Party is supported by good people. And so Song Qingling is not of the CCP, but she is given the job to recruit useful foreigners to the CCP in the mid-1930s. So Mao, who at this point is based with the CCP in the northwest near Yan'an, sends out a request to Shanghai that he needs a Western doctor to look after him, and he needs a Western journalist who can get the story of the Chinese communists out to the wider world. So this is a context in which the communist state is being blockaded by the nationalists. The nationalists are determined to finish off the job they started in 1927 and really eradicate the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a kind of material blockade. It's very hard to get supplies into the Chinese Communist state, but it's also very, very difficult for the Chinese communists to make a case for themselves as political actors. So they really need a well-connected, fluent journalist to portray them in a sympathetic way. And this is where Song Qingling recommends Edgar Snow to them.
So after a big adventure where he takes, boat, train, rail, hiking, ferries, or what have you, Edgar Snow arrives. What was his experience like? How was he treated?
He was treated very well as far as one can make out from the portrait that emerges in Red Star Over China. He was given a wonderful, warm reception by the government of the Chinese Communist state when he arrived. So he was effectively given a kind of state leader treatment himself, which he wrote affected him very deeply. Actually, he was very impressed. He was very taken by this reception. He was given fantastic access to the top leadership of the CCP, above all to Mao, who gave him a series of interviews late into the night, which generated some 20,000 transcribed words, which then became the basis for a very famous biographical portrait of Mao that Edgar Snow put together in Red Star Over China, and which actually aspects of it still remain kind of our main source on Mao's early life, on Mao's childhood, on his relationship with his father, and so on and so forth. The communist state in northwest China was a very poor area, but the Central Committee made sure that Edgar Snow did not want for anything materially. So, all the sort of creature comforts that he could reasonably expect were his, sort of towels and hot water, lots of food. He wasn't allowed to pay for anything. So he really was overwhelmed with hospitality, and I think you can see his sort of sense of gratitude for that hospitality come through the very warm way that he wrote up his experiences of the Chinese Communist state in Red Star.
Sure. So I love how he apparently Zhu De, the founder of the PLA, found time to play basketball with him, which he describes as a rather quote unquote wistful game, whatever that means in
whatever that means.
1930s American NBA analysis. So the idea, Edgar Snow, he paints this idealized portrait of Mao as a Lincoln-esque figure, which is really far-fetched to think of from, contemporary glasses. I mean, we have like the tall and skinny versus short and fat. We've got like melancholic and brooding versus like creepy dictator, self-assured. And then we have like surrounded by sycophants with purges versus this whole team of rivals idea. Could you talk a little bit about the sort of like American revolutionary glasses that Edgar Snow brought to his depiction and how that helped the book resonate, I imagine, abroad?
Yeah, I think you've picked on a really revealing turn of phrase, which shows that Edgar Snow is trying to translate Mao into American, if you like, into an American frame of reference. And that idea can be applied to other aspects of Snow's portrayal of the CCP and the Chinese Communist state in the Northwest. He really seems to be at pains to portray them as people who are really in tune with, certain values in the American dream. They're relaxed, easygoing, but also serious, idealistic, patriotic, open to other influences and ideas. They're open to being taught how to play Snow's card games. And Edgar Snow's portrayal in this way was internationally very, very impactful. That Edgar Snow's write-up of Mao really did transform Mao for the first time into an international political personality. It set up a channel of communication between Snow and the White House with Roosevelt. So, in terms of how the Americans perceived the Chinese communists at this time, there was a clear impact, and some of the State Department officers who later made their way to Yan'an during the Second World War, they had read Snow's very positive account of the Chinese Communist Party, so it's hard to imagine that they themselves were not affected and predisposed by this very positive account.
What lessons do you think contemporary foreign correspondents should take from the Edgar Snow experience?
I think there are still certain continuities between the Edgar Snow experience and contemporary Chinese official hospitality. My reading of far more recent documents about tours which are arranged by Chinese officialdom around parts of China, it suggests that there is still a hope that by sort of overwhelming visitors with hospitality and a sort of rather controlled sort of access, that you can win positive write-ups. So this is an idea that is tried out with snow, but continues through the Mao era and in the post-Mao era as well.
So let's come now to the idea of brainwashing, this idea that was born, at least in the Western mind, out of the Korean War. And this guy, Edward Hunter, who you write, tapped into a rich stream of anxiety about the expansion of Chinese communism.
Yes. So this anxiety about Chinese communism had a variety of causes. Of course, the immediate, most important trigger was the success of the Chinese Communist Revolution in October 1949. But the following year, American and UN forces came up directly against the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Army, or it was renamed for the purposes, in the Korean War. And so this collision between the Chinese army and American and UN forces sort of really cemented these anxieties about what Chinese communist power in the world might look like.
So we have the Korean War, and at first the Americans are doing pretty well, pushing back the North Koreans, but all of a sudden there is this Chinese human wave tactics that ends up capturing thousands and thousands of American POWs. As the war winds up, the POWs are given a choice of whether to stay in China or to come back to the U.S. And as you write, a handful of them actually decided not to be repatriated, which is something that really shocked the American public. And to explain this, the manifestation of not loving mother liberty or what have you, you have this guy Edward Hunter who comes onto the scene, and he describes this idea of Chinese mind control as, quote, witchcraft with the incantations, trances, poisons and potions, with the strange flair of science about it all, like a devil dancer in a tuxedo carrying his magic brew in a test tube. Where does this idea come from?
It's partly produced by the broader climate of McCarthyism. The United States is having its own anti-communist witch hunt, and this creates a climate of susceptibility to fears that there is communist subversion all around the United States. But these fears become cemented by the events of the Korean War. First of all, you actually have a physical collision between US soldiers and Chinese communist soldiers. And then, as you say, you have this event which is truly shocking to popular and political American consciousness, that out of these 7,000 some American POWs who were captured by North Korean and Chinese forces between 1950 and 1953, around 20, when offered a choice about repatriation, they choose not to come back to the United States, but instead to go to China. And the explanation that is given for their choice is that they have been brainwashed, they have been remolded some way by Chinese communist interrogators in these camps between 1950 and 1953. And this creates this idea that communist China is to be feared not only as a hostile military power, as it has shown itself to be during the Korean War, but also it possesses, at least as the security services in the United States argues, China seems to possess a kind of new unbeatable weapon for mind control, an ability to carry out brainwashing, to take people apart mentally and put them back together. And these fears are quite clearly expressed in a whole sort of swirl of articles and cultural productions in the US throughout the 1950s, and the most famous of which is the film The Manchurian Candidate. And the plot itself is rather complex, but a central idea of it is that an all-American boy, an all-American GI, captured by the Koreans and the Chinese and the Soviets during the Korean War, has been secretly reprogrammed, released back into the United States, and then becomes a sort of weapon for destruction of American democracy. So there's this sense that
with Frank Sinatra starring, guys.
Indeed, no less, no less.
I showed up in China in June 2017, not knowing much more than ni hao. 2 months later, I was HSK 3.5, confidently having hour-long conversations and traveling alone in rural Yunnan. By the time I started my graduate program that fall, I wasn't the foreigner who forced Chinese groups to switch into English. In my program, there were plenty of students who came to China with no Mandarin background, but none of them got to near the Chinese level I did, largely because they didn't have the right environment to invest in the basics. So where did I make all this critical progress? At CLI in Guilin, one of the few places that teaches Chinese right. In 4 hours of daily one-on-one sessions with engaged and flexible teachers, and in an environment that supports immersion outside the classroom. Unlike in Beijing or Shanghai, you'll be forced to use your Chinese in daily life, and won't fall into a friend group of expats. Guilin isn't your average Chinese small city either. As a tourist hub, it's developed enough to provide you with whatever creature comforts you want, from upscale gyms to chill cafes and fancy malls, all while being surrounded by gorgeous mountains and next to no pollution. CLI isn't just for Mandarin beginners, it supports all levels of learning. It's not just for students either. In fact, its median age is 28. To learn more, go to studycli.org and enter offer code ChinaEconTalk for $100 off.
Support for this week's show comes from Brattle Street Educational Counseling. Stressed out about college applications? Brattle Street Educational Counseling can help. They provide guidance throughout the whole process and offer workshops for students looking to work in small groups at a rigorous pace. The workshops include hours of one-on-one attention, from college essays to standardized test prep to interviewing and applications. Brattle Street offers support for any student. Brattle Street, BRATTLE Street.com, helping you get where you want to go.
Bringing this a little back to the present, lessons for, lessons you might take away for just how the U.S. ended up misinterpreting this brainwash attempt. You write that basically the level of Chinese expertise in this time period was really decimated by McCarthyism, because anyone who's remotely affiliated with policies that quote unquote lost China, just by virtue of having contacts in the mainland, lost their roles. So people who spoke Chinese or who had spent time in this part of the world ended up not getting the ear of senior leadership. Yes,
and I think though that that there was that local, very traumatic effect on that generation of wartime State Department Chinese expertise in the US. I would say that this episode has a much longer afterlife, which has been, brilliantly explored and uncovered both by journalists and historians of post-war United States. So I'm thinking here of Jane Meyer's work, that she's the New Yorker journalist who wrote a very disturbing and eye-opening book called The Dark Side, which was, where the justification and the ideas for the suspension of important legal constraints against, for example, torture during the War in Terror came from. And she and other cultural historians have argued that a lot of the thinking about the sorts of very aggressive interrogation and also torture techniques which were used by parts of the American security establishment during the War in Terror went back to assumptions about Chinese mind control and the need for the US to develop alternatives to combat this Chinese mind control of the 1950s. So this set of ideas, they have this set of assumptions about China and quote unquote brainwashing. They have a very local significance in the 1950s, but they also have a much longer range impact on the CIA, the security state in the United States.
Horrifying. Another thing to thank Mao for. So coming up to chapter 4, World Revolution, you have this quote where we've gotten through the 50s, but we're now into your what you phrase as high Maoism. So high Maoism, you write, is showcased a particular form of internationalism, universal in theory but parochial in practice. It made a utopian case for the global relevance of Maoism while engaging in petty doctrinal disputes with the Soviet Union. It made a bid for a world role while destroying China's diplomatic relations with almost every part of the world. It shouted about universal solidarity while asserting Mao's planetary leadership. It was often more about domestic amour propre than international realpolitik. In broad strokes, how does Mao's conception of what world revolution should look like in his image play out?
Well, I think without understanding Mao's deep emotional attachment to the idea of generating world revolution, without taking this on board, we can't understand the standout events of what I call high Maoism. So this is Maoism of the late 1950s and 1960s. This is the period where Mao is sort of unleashing his most radical ideas for transforming China, mainly by mobilizing tens of millions of Chinese people to achieve his political experiments.
Maybe we can start by talking about the rivalry with the USSR and how this fed into this, I guess, what ended up becoming a bit of a frenzy. More than a bit of a frenzy.
So Mao's bid to lead the world revolution begins with him picking an increasingly cantankerous quarrel with the Soviets. So after Stalin's death, in 1956, Stalin's successor, Khrushchev, makes his secret speech in which he denounces Stalin's tyranny and his mass murders during the terror. And Mao, for a variety of reasons, is very angry about this. First of all, he's angry because Khrushchev has not consulted him in advance that he's going to do this. But he's also angry because Mao himself, although he had personal quarrels with Stalin, Mao was also a deep admirer of key aspects of the Stalinist project. For example, sort of radical mobilizations to sort of create far-reaching economic and political transformations, breakneck collectivization to achieve sort of crash industrialization, and of course the personality cult. So the secret speech in 1956 is the beginning of what historians then and now call the Sino-Soviet split. And this is, often a very sort of hard to understand phenomenon. It sort of consists of, the Soviets and the Chinese hurling doctrinal insults at each other. But the intellectual, political nub of it is that Mao feels that after Stalin's death, Khrushchev is losing, the Soviet Union are losing their revolutionary bite. They're making nice with the United States. They're talking about peaceful coexistence, and they're turning their back on the idea of a kind of violent tumultuous world revolution. So the Chinese Communist Party under Mao decides that they're going to fly the flag of global insurgency for the world revolution, and this generates a sort of long series of insults to the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union responds to often in kind, and without taking on board these events, there are many aspects to the political reasons for the Cultural Revolution that we can't understand. So these set of events, although often sort of opaque and, as I say, sort of bizarrely sectarian, are deeply productive of history within China and also beyond.
Yeah, just the level of pettiness I just find hysterical. Mao in 1957 goes to visit Khrushchev. He sees a Swan Lake. He says, "Why don't they just dance normally?" And then he walks out. 1956, Kosygin wants to bring the two countries together. Mao replies that he pledged to denounce the Soviets for 10,000 years, but as a special concession, he would reduce that time period by a millennium. But further than that, he could not go. So, I mean, he was clearly like relishing in this and, seeing it as a way to put his stamp on global affairs.
That's right, and I think we can't understand Maoism, Mao's ideas and Mao's practices without, of course, taking into account Mao's own personality. And this comes back to another deep contradiction within him that, on the one hand, he was determined to build a, one-party militarized state that worshipped its supreme leader. But on the other hand, throughout his career and particularly towards the end of his life, he consistently saw himself as a rebel, as an outlier, as someone who made trouble. You see this very strongly in the Cultural Revolution, but you also see it in the way that he tries and often succeeds to provoke the Soviets.
Let's talk a little bit about the Friendship Hotel, which is one of the ways that the Chinese sought to spread revolution by bringing revolutionaries all around the world into Beijing and kind of giving them the crash course in Maoism. So you write that in this hotel there were melancholic Chilean bolero singers, Colombian actors, and the doctrinaire British Maoist Elise Fairfax Cholmondeley, who allegedly danced in jubilation at the burning ruins of the British legation when it was torched by the Red Guards in 1967. So what was going on with all these foreigners running around China, and how did the Chinese think of them, and what was their experience like?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Elsie Fairfax Cholmondeley, who to my mind has always sounded far more like a character from a P.G. Wodehouse novel than a Maoist. First of all, these foreigners, where they're staying in the Friendship Hotel from the late 1950s, particularly early 1960s onwards, and the Friendship Hotel was originally built to house Soviet advisors and technicians, and those are all pulled from China by Khrushchev in 1960. So in response to that, in response to the Sino-Soviet split, Mao and his lieutenants want to create Beijing, but also training camps in South and East China as hubs for this diverse bunch of international rebels that you mention. And there's, I think, an element of amour propre here, a bit of the old kind of 天下主义, the idea of China as the centre of the universe, the centre of the world, or sort of in contemporary Marxist terms, as the centre of the world revolution. So drawing this global community of rebels sort of shores up China's own self-perception as this centre of the world revolution. So there's an element of revolutionary vanity there. But I would also say that the creation of the sort of the donation of all these training facilities and training resources is also very, very productive of global insurgency, especially in the third world. So I'm not saying that everybody who attended political and military training in China at this time went on to make revolution in their own country. So, absolutely some of these individuals flaked out of the revolution. So I'm thinking, for example, of this Venezuelan guerrilla I encountered who left China after a couple of years in the late 60s because he couldn't locate a reliable supply of whiskey. So, this is someone who wasn't about to follow through.
Amadou of Niger, as he comes to us down through the archives. So after his arrival, he informed the director of the State Broadcasting Administration that the Quran permitted him to have 4 wives. He had already taken 3 in Africa, but was reserving a spot for a Chinese consort and wanted to purchase one while in China. When the director explained that this would be impossible, an agitated Amadou protested that he was not asking for a handout. He was willing to pay for a woman.
And that story comes from the remarkable memoirs of Sidney Rittenberg, who was an American who made his way out to the Chinese Communist state just after World War II, and stayed in China until the 1970s, despite 2 very brutal periods of imprisonment. But just to talk again about the impact of these training opportunities. So, as you say, there were people who weren't really serious about revolution or necessarily serious about the revolution, but others who spent time in China getting political and military training in the 60s above all, went on to lead insurgencies that changed the destinies of the countries in which they operated. So one example would be Josiah Tongagora, the military commander behind Zanu's victory over southern Rhodesia through the 1970s. Another example would be Abimael Guzman, who, as leader of the Shining Path, the Sendero Luminoso in Peru, directed throughout the 1980s a Maoist civil war that claimed almost 70,000 lives. So this training, it could have a transformative impact on the lives of those who undertook it and on the states in which they worked.
Sure, there's also a history of the U.S. doing this sort of thing, taking mid-level officers in armies, particularly in Latin America, bringing them to the U.S. for a year as like a finishing program, as a fellowship. To get a master's or what have you. I remember visiting one of these, I think the Navy runs one in Washington, D.C., and, they have this like wall of fame of all the people who've gone on to be ministers. But there's also, a fair number of folks who ended up, turning out to be particularly heinous dictators. So, there's a long tradition both in the West and the East of these sort of finishing schools. I guess like Yenching Academy, you can also call one of them. Who knows if China will be happy or unhappy with the way Jordan Schneider turns out. But I personally am a recipient of CCP largesse.
Could I just come in with something on that, actually?
Yeah, of course.
I'm really glad you made that point. When we're talking about the ways in which China under Mao tried to export revolutionary, both in terms of ideology, but also in harder currencies of revolution, so things like money, weapons, and training for global insurgencies. It's, as you say, absolutely essential to point out that China was far from, the only game in town. They weren't the only country doing this during the Cold War. The CIA was doing it left, right, and centre. The history of the CIA, the history of US foreign policy is littered with sort of horrendous interventions, especially in the developing world. We can think about Iran, we can think about Indonesia, Latin America, and so on. So many examples. And of course, the Soviet Union were doing something very similar through the KGB, through the International Department, through different organizations. So China is not unique in what it's doing. What I thought was important to point out, though, is the story of what China is doing is far less well known than the story of what, say, the CIA did or the Soviet Union did. And that's why I thought it was just important to tell this story.
So let's close with the impact of the Cultural Revolution on the broader aims. You write that it was a set of events with aspirations to global solidarity and revolution, but which generated extreme brute xenophobia and authoritarianism. So explain this dynamic where on the one hand, Mao wants to be a global revolutionary, but on the other hand, anything that's foreign could get you killed.
Well, motoring the Cultural Revolution, both at home and abroad, was the idea that China was the centre of the world revolution, and this precious revolution had to be protected in China for the revolution inside and outside China to succeed. So, the success of the Chinese Revolution bore directly on the success of the world revolution. But Mao argued that the revolution was always under threat from public and undeclared enemies, above all Americans, the Soviet Union, and people who are in cahoots with them. During the Cultural Revolution, the definition of people who are conspiring against the Chinese and therefore the world revolution was anybody who could be suspected of sympathy with what Mao had deemed counter-revolutionary. So the old, the foreign, especially Western or Soviet influences, bourgeois culture, for example. And so Mao and the Cultural Revolution validated ruthless violence against such sort of international, foreign, cosmopolitan tendencies, precisely paradoxically, in Mao's mind, to safeguard the international project of the revolution.
Talk a little bit about the impact that the Cultural Revolution had on Soviet policy.
I already talked about the way there was a sea change in Soviet domestic and foreign policy in the late 1950s, with Khrushchev hewing more to the idea of peaceful coexistence with the United States. That he still believed that the communist model would be victorious, but it would be victorious through persuading people of its virtues, of its superiority, i.e. through material development, rather than through sort of violent military revolutions. But with one aspect of Mao's take on the Sino-Soviet split was to accuse the Soviets of being quote-unquote revisionists, of making up with the Americans and turning their backs on the world proletariat, especially in the developing world, the colonial world, or the sort of decolonizing or the recently decolonized world. And in terms of its own publicity materials, Mao's China particularly targeted audiences in the colonial or decolonizing world. So Mao's so-called external propaganda made much of the idea that only Mao's China was really the center of anti-imperialism. Only Mao's China was really going to stand up to the imperialism of American foreign policy. It argued that the Soviets under Khrushchev had effectively become imperialists in their own way. The Soviets were extremely rattled by this sort of massive campaign to discredit them in the decolonizing world, because both the Soviets and the Chinese, and actually also the Americans, they saw the decolonizing world almost as this kind of blank slate, a host of new countries looking for political models. And so each of the big powers in the Cold War hoped that they could extend their hard and soft power by getting these new states to take up their own political models. So when the Chinese under Mao were so seriously bad-mouthing the Soviets took this very, very seriously. And I think it's very plausible to argue that anxiety about looking insufficiently radical in the third world, in the developing world, really pushes a recalibration of Soviet foreign policy. So although sort of Khrushchev himself is moving towards a more moderate policy, because he doesn't want the Chinese accusations to have any traction, he and leaders after him tend towards being more expansive in terms of the aid and the support that they're offering to insurgencies in the developing world. The Vietnam War is a perfect example of this. It's Chinese rhetoric about the Soviets being revisionist and abandoning the revolution that triggers the Soviets to donate a huge amount of aid and support to the Vietnamese communists. And so, without that aid, it's hard to imagine that the Vietnamese communists would be able to face off to the Americans in the way that we did. And everybody knows what a trauma within sort of American foreign policy and American consciousness the stalemate and failure in Vietnam turned out to be.
Julia, see you next week for part 2 of the Maoism, A Global History deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.